I'm Dick Clark, the chairman of the Board of Governors of the Middle East Institute, and on behalf of the Board of Governors, I want to welcome you all, excellencies, friends, to MEI 2016. A quick report first from the Board of Governors to all of you who are members. If you were watching that video a few seconds ago, you saw our plans for the new MEI campus. I'm very pleased to report to you, members and friends, that the Board of Governors has approved the renovation of the existing facility, which will begin in the first quarter of 2016. And the Board of Governors has approved, and the property owner next door has agreed to the acquisition of the new building next door, which will allow us to create the MEI campus in 2016. Those of you who have been here before know what that means. We're coming after you to pay for it. This is a great dinner tonight, a great event tomorrow. We want to thank all of the staff at MEI for their hard work in making it happen. We also want to thank the members of the advisory committee who are serving as tonight's hosts. The advisory committee includes Ambassador Ryan Crocker, Dr. Richard Debb, Mr. Shafiq Gaber, Ambassador Tom Pickering, Ambassador Jim Smith, Ambassador Frank Wisner, General Tony Zinni, and Abbas Zuaider. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for your work on the advisory committee and for being our official hosts. We also want to thank the many embassies in town and corporations who make all of this possible by their donations to this charitable organization that is one of the oldest think tanks in Washington. We want to thank especially those ambassadors who have come tonight from Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon, Morocco, Pakistan, and any others that I've missed. I apologize in advance. Thank you, excellencies, for your support throughout the year, and thank you for being here tonight. This is a great dinner. We've got, as always, at our annual banquet, the awards that MEI gives out every year, and tonight we are so very, very happy to give out two awards to two fabulous people. First, from the UAE, from the Emirate of Sharjah, Sheikh Ahur Al-Qasimi, who has made enormous contributions to culture and art in the Middle East, and who we are delighted to honor tonight. Also honoring tonight someone who's made equally enormous contributions to the world of finance, Mohammed El-Arian, the man who I think all of you know invented the phrase, the new normal, and has made such great contributions to the field of finance. Tonight, however, before the awards, and before we get a chance to say a lot more about our honorees, our first event is going to be a speech by one of the few people in the world I call my personal heroes, Ambassador Robert Ford. And to introduce Ambassador Ford and to take us through the evening, the woman who makes all of this happen every day, Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain, the president of the Middle East Institute. And the phrase I'm about to say is a phrase I really like saying. Madam President.
Well, thank you, Dick. Thank you for your welcoming remarks and for your introduction to now the 69th Middle East Institute Annual Banquet. I'm so grateful for your leadership and your commitment to the Middle East Institute as our chairman. You know, it's fair to say, Dick, that your knowledge of the region and your friendships throughout the region have been a major factor contributing to the explosion and growth of the Institute and its expansion over the last several years. Last year, I revealed our plans, our intentions to renovate the Middle East Institute at our historic headquarters on N Street and to build a larger conference room. It's taken a while. It's taken a lot longer than we thought it would, but I'm happy to report that those blueprints are written. The building permits are almost finished, but come what may, we're going to start building in just a few weeks. Our chairman is going to have the satisfaction of we're going to give him the satisfaction of knocking down the first wall, so we expect him to swing that sledgehammer. And to let some of you, I see some chuckling in the corner over there, but for those who want to let the rest of you in on a little inside joke, when Dick Clark was Assistant Secretary for the Political Military Bureau of the Department of State, and the State Department was going to renovate his office suite, it was a little slow, kind of like what we've been experiencing, but Dick, known for his patience, was suddenly impatient one day, took a hammer, thought he'd get the project going, and started knocking down the wall. Problem was, it was the wrong wall. As we've noted, MEI has experienced some amazing expansion in all of our target areas, our outreach, our web viewership, our Language Institute number of students, our program attendance, and most especially our policy impact. And I, too, want to, as Dick has, I want to thank the hardworking staff of the Middle East Institute for their loyalty and for their commitment and for the good work that they've done. Please continue to eat your salad, but I want to introduce our speaker, Ambassador. Over the last many years, the Middle East Institute has drawn on a very rich and distinguished roster of keynote speakers at this banquet. We've included Bill Clinton, National Security Advisor Susan Rice, Dr. Zabrig Brzezinski, Madeleine Albright, and many others who've been able to explain and unpack American foreign policy in the region. But this year, we really didn't have to go very far to recruit one of the nation's most celebrated and sought-after speakers, Ambassador Robert Ford. Robert Ford is a senior scholar at the Middle East Institute. He's better known throughout the United States as the last resident ambassador U.S. ambassador in Damascus. He was pulled out with the rest of his staff when the security situation became too dicey, and Secretary Clinton decided that it was best to withdraw the diplomatic staff there. But you all will remember the footage of Robert in 2011 when the people of Hama rose up in protest. He was the guy in the baseball cap that was enveloped by crowds of Syrians who were very appreciative that he'd come. Somebody had come to listen to their grievances. Somebody had come to listen to their aspirations. And he listened, and he spoke to them in his fluent Arabic. Robert deeply touched the crowds of oppressed Syrian people with his openness and with his genuine concern for their welfare. And he continues to do so even in his retirement. But now he does it from the platform of the Middle East Institute, and for that I'm grateful too. Ambassador Ford has done more, and this is what I really appreciate too, he's done more to dispel the myth that American diplomats are, overly formal, cookie-pushing, reception wonks. He has represented a truth about my colleagues that too often goes unappreciated. In fact, and as many former ambassadors and current diplomats can attest, the work of diplomats in the field is often dangerous. It's sometimes exhilarating. It's never pointless. But the truly effective ambassador, as Robert Ford so clearly personifies, speaks from his heart. So, Robert, your story, please.
Good evening, everyone. It is really a pleasure to be here tonight, and it's an honor for me to be here tonight, especially with so many people that I respect. I see so many colleagues from the State Department here. I can't even mention them all, but there is one I have to mention. Wendy, you were very generous in that introduction. Thank you. The man who was my mentor in the State Department, the man who taught me about how to be a good diplomat and maintain high professional standards, is with us tonight. I don't know where in this big room, but Ambassador Ronald Newman is here. And maybe, Ron, if you would just stand up. Ah, there, okay. Much of diplomacy also involves teaching and mentoring, and Ron exemplified that during my career. So let me first start by thanking Richard Clark, who is the chairman of our board. Richard is a real visionary for all of us working with him, and I've learned a lot from Richard. I've even learned things about cyber security from Richard, and I can tell you that, for example, I thought my computer was safe, has antivirus, has anti-malware, and then I talked to Richard, and now I'm afraid to turn my computer on even. I'd like to thank Wendy Chamberlain, who is the president of our institute, for her vision as well, and for her superb day-to-day support of our entire team. The Middle East Institute really is a team. It's a group of people. It's a huge pleasure to work with Wendy. And I also just want to mention, they're here somewhere in this crowded room, Paul Salem and Kate Seeley, who are vice presidents at the Institute. And they're just genuinely nice people. They're very good at what they do, but they're also nice, and it's just a real pleasure to work with them. And I have to tell you, when I retired from the State Department, a year and a half ago, I wanted to join the Middle East Institute because the Institute itself is different. Richard, Wendy, Paul, Kate, and the entire staff help organize not just policy forums where people like me can get on and blah, blah about the political crisis of the day on television or on radio. The Middle East Institute teaches languages. It teaches Arabic. It teaches Persian. It teaches Hebrew. It teaches Turkish. What other institute in Washington does that to help expand understanding of the region? The Middle East Institute doesn't just talk about politics. It hosted a Palestinian musician during the past year. It organized a conference about health care for refugee populations and how to get health care to refugee populations. It did a program about how to help young entrepreneurs in Egypt, and another program about how to combat theft of antiquities, a real problem now in places like Iraq and Syria with the Islamic State. Middle East Institute did a program about Sufi poets, and it did a program about how we can help e-learning in Egypt. The Middle East Institute has the biggest library of books about the Middle East and North Africa in Washington, except for a small library called the Library of Congress. I used to use that library when I was a student here. It's a beautiful library. I recommend to all of you to visit it. It's fabulous. The Middle East Institute, in sum, does not just look at the Middle East as a political problem in Washington. Rather, the Middle East Institute, with its programs and its efforts, looks at the Middle East as a place where people live, and they strive, and they learn, and they try for better for the next generations. And it's that kind of holistic outlook that attracted me to the Middle East Institute. It really is unique that way in Washington. Wendy asked me to talk about what's happening in the region now. And I was a little puzzled. She said, we'll talk for about 20 minutes. And I was reminded of a story of a British archaeologist at the turn of the century in London, stuffy London. And the British archaeologist was asked to give a presentation for half an hour about his scholarly research and his digs at ancient temples in Southeast Asia. Half an hour at the British Museum. And he was very upset, only half an hour, and he spluttered and he complained to his friend, Oscar Wilde, how can I possibly explain everything I know in just 1/2 hour? And Oscar Wilde told him, well, speak slowly. So I'm going to try to speak slowly, but not too slowly, and offer 3 observations and close with a personal story. And I offer these observations about what's happening in the region in the context of someone who worked there for 30 years, beginning with an assignment in the Peace Corps in Morocco, where I was a teacher at a high school in a small town in the middle of Morocco, in central Morocco. The region is changing. And in some cases, the region is going into uncharted waters, places we have not seen before. My first observation is that the Sunni-Shia competition, and you'll hear about it tomorrow, but the Sunni-Shia competition is very real, and it will not go away easily. When I was a young teacher, long hair, mustache, not the kind you'd want your daughter to marry, when I was a long-haired Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco, we didn't even hear about Shia. We didn't even hear about it in Morocco. The only time I even remember Moroccans talking about it was on Ashura when we were eating candy, and one of them said, you know, the Shia mark today not with sweets, but they mourn because of the events surrounding the battle at Karbala. And they said it in a very nonchalant, matter-of-fact way. It wasn't political at all for them. There was no venom, there was no poison about it. It was just, they were just talking. But you here tonight, you know about the sectarianism and the fighting that's going on in the region in places like Syria and Iraq, Yemen, Bahrain, and Lebanon. It's different now. We haven't seen this. And the fear and the resentment of many in Sunni Arab communities in places like Syria and Iraq is feeding extremism. It's feeding extremism. That's where the Islamic State comes from. I'm not trying to justify that resentment or that fear, and I'm certainly not trying to justify the actions that some individuals take because of their anger and their resentment. I'm just telling you what I myself heard constantly when I was in Iraq and later in Syria. And the worry of encirclement by Iran is driving a more assertive Gulf policy towards Iran. This is especially true when people in the Gulf sense that little by little, khutwa khutwa, the Americans are starting to withdraw from the region. I think this is hard for a lot of Americans to understand. Here in the United States, how many of you Americans think very much about the different Christian denominations? Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans? I dare say very few of us pay it much of any attention. And so it's a little difficult for us to understand how important the differences sometimes can be inside the larger worldwide Muslim community. And that fear and that anger at perceived Shia oppression and aggression among Sunni Arab communities in places like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Americans, I conclude, can't work well in the region until they understand this divide between Sunnis and Shia. We will consistently be ineffective, as we were for a long time in Iraq. A second observation. In the past summer and autumn, the world media seized upon the desperate plight of refugees coming out of countries like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We've seen political backlash because of this refugee flow in European countries. We've seen pledges from the American administration, very welcome pledges, to take in more Syrian refugees. And there has been backlash in our country, too, after those pledges. Think about the candidacies of people like Ted Cruz and Donald Trump and what they have said. The Syrian refugees are, of course, trying to get away from terrible fighting in their own country, and Iraqis, too. But the refugee question is not new. When I was the American ambassador in Algeria between 2006 and 2008, there were hundreds, I mean this, there were hundreds of North Africans every month climbing into small boats and trying to get across the Mediterranean to Spain and Italy. The Algerian young people, now I got to talk to some of them, called them haragas. Haraga is a takeoff on an Arabic word that means to burn. And the reason they called them haragas is if you did make it to Spain or Italy, you would immediately burn your papers and demand refugee status. These haragas were risking huge odds to cross to Europe. They were looking, of course, for jobs, and they were hoping to build their own families one day. Most of them didn't make it. Most of them drowned, and there was a constant flow of boats going out and young people drowning. Not just young men, often young women as well. And so, just as you see these pictures of Syrians and Iraqis, Afghans and others trying to get from Turkey into Europe, I also remember that this goes back even to the haragas. The refugee influx, though, now is so big, 218,000 last week. 1 week, 218,000, according to the European Union. It's putting pressure on friends in places like Europe. I don't know if you noticed this, but the president of the European Union Council said just 2 days ago that this is threatening to bring down the entire Schengen Agreement freedom of movement in Europe, because European countries are now starting to put up border controls within Europe. It's threatening, actually, the unity of Europe, according to some European leaders. But the refugee problem, I hate to say, is not going away. In fact, if the fighting in Syria and Iraq continues, and it probably will, and if economic conditions in the region continue to struggle, and they probably will, given low oil prices and instability, well, there almost certainly are going to be even bigger refugee flows in the years to come. There's a population bulge in the Arab countries. So many young people, more than half the population is under the age of 20 in these countries. That population bulge is just going to push people out of their countries in search of jobs, in search of hope, to places like Europe. And this brings me to my third final observation. Many analysts, including some analysts in the Arab world, have accented that the Arab Spring, which was supposed to improve countries in the Arab world, bring better government, bring new hope, new opportunity, the Arab Spring that was supposed to bring hope and opportunity has turned instead to a political winter. And with the horrible violence, Syria, Yemen, Libya, and events in countries like Egypt and Bahrain, you can understand why they would draw such a conclusion. I have to say, my own assessment of the Arab Spring is different. First, the Arab Spring was inevitable. It couldn't have been stopped by Americans or by any other foreigners. The spread of information among people in the region, their rising expectations based on their greater knowledge, and especially their expectations of good governance among a more informed public, made the Arab Spring inevitable. You know, when I was an Arabic student in Cairo, 1983, there were 3 TV stations. And they were all government-owned. And just to give you an example, Channel 1, people there just called it Channel 0, because that's how dull it was, and Channel 2 and 3 weren't much better. If you go out to the Middle East now, check into a hotel, or if you live there, and you plug into Arabsat, you have literally hundreds of channels, some playing music, some playing movies, an awful lot of news from around the world. So people see how other people around the world are living. This is new. They never had this before. It's gotten to the point now where if something happens in a country, people whip out a phone. I still don't know how to use it. I'm afraid after talking to Richard to even mess with it. But people video what's going on in their own country. they put it up on the internet, on YouTube or something, it's on Al Jazeera and it's on Al Arabiya within hours. As Syria descended into violence in 2011, government was starting to kill people frequently, regularly, dozens every week. I told Syrian Foreign Minister Walid Muallim that they could not apply the old rules to the new situation. The Syrian government couldn't just kill people, try to keep it quiet enough to intimidate the locals, and not earn the anger and the reprobation of the larger country by keeping them in ignorance of what was happening in this particular neighborhood or that particular city. I told Minister Muallim, the world has changed and you won't be able to prevent people from knowing around the world what you're doing within minutes. I said, you will have to think of a better way to work with people. That's what I told him in 2011. Unfortunately, his authorities decided to try a different route. And so things have gotten much, much worse. And yet, as I look at it, there is still some hope in the region. Let me talk for a minute about what's happening in the next phase of the Arab Spring. In Lebanon, which is struggling with 1 million refugees, a quarter of their population is now refugees, there are young people going out regularly into the streets of Beirut in peaceful protests. And they are demanding an end to government corruption. They're demanding an end to government cronyism. And they're asking, to start with, that the Lebanese government organize garbage collection. They have a wonderful name for this protest movement. It's Talat Rahetkum, which literally means in Arabic, you stink. And they're saying that to their government. It's very peaceful. They're just demonstrations. But I want to show you a photo of one of the demonstrations. Scott, can we do the first picture? Yeah. So this picture is one of these demonstrations. This is about 2 months ago in Beirut. Those of you who read Arabic will notice that the banner behind these women is calling for secularism. In other words, it's denouncing sectarianism. It's contrasting the problems of sectarianism by calling for secularism and democracy and social justice. Scott, can we do the next picture, please? Here's another picture of the street protests in Beirut. This is about a month old. These young people here are denouncing corruption. The third one from your left is the one denouncing corruption. The very last one, the young man on the far left, is denouncing sectarianism again. Notice that the young lady is covered, but she's still participating in a little protest against sectarianism and corruption. Same kind of thing is happening in Iraq right now. I just came back from Iraq. I was there with Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, who I think is here somewhere. Did I see Jim? Yeah. So Jim and I were there just a month ago, and we had breakfast with some politically connected people who are working on education, and they were talking about the protests in Baghdad. And if you follow events in Iraq, you know that there have been these protests dating back to last summer. Now, what are they protesting in Baghdad? Same thing, governance and corruption. They're especially anxious in Iraq about electricity. And if you've ever spent a summer in Iraq without air conditioning, you too would be demanding electricity as a matter of urgent national security. But Scott, if you could go to the next picture. This is a picture of one of the protests that an Iraqi friend sent to me. What's interesting in this picture is the signs they're holding. The one on the bottom right says, "I'm a Shia student and I'm against sectarianism." The one in the middle, "I'm a Sunni student and I'm against sectarianism." The one up on the top is, "I'm a Yazidi student. I'm against sectarianism. And the last sign on the left is demanding that we be unified. Our life depends on our being unified, it says. Now, I'd ask those of you who know the Middle East a little bit, just showed you people in Beirut and Baghdad, Iraq, rejecting sectarianism. What countries in the past 30 years in the Middle East have suffered more sectarian brutality than Lebanon and Iraq? Very, very few, I would wager. I don't want to overstate this. I don't want to say that the rainbow has landed and things are going to get better. We've seen peaceful protests in other countries, sentiments like this, urging nonviolence. It's possible that these young people are not going to prevail. They may not organize. They may not be able to organize. Maybe the government will stop them. They may not be able to really influence national politics. But what I do understand from what I just showed you is that there clearly are a lot of young people who don't want violence and who don't want sectarian politics. And they're young now, and they're going to be around for a long time to come. And thus, my feeling, if you could do the next picture, Scott, my feeling about the Arab Spring is kind of like what Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai said to the secretly visiting Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor at the time, who visited China in 1971 at the beginning of the opening between the United States and China. And Kissinger in his memoirs describes a very long, fascinating discussion with the Chinese Premier, Zhou Enlai. And Kissinger at one point asked Zhou Enlai, Mr. Premier, we're talking about world events, how do you assess the French Revolution? And according to Kissinger, Zhou Enlai thought about it for a moment and then said, Mr. Secretary, it is too early to know yet. And that's what I think about the Arab Spring. It's too early to know yet. But when I think about how we as Americans can relate to this younger and more politically aware generation in the Arab world, my very first thought is that this is not a military question. The U.S. can't resolve Sunni-Shia competition. Can't resolve it militarily. And our military, as skillful as it is, really only provides a short-term respite from extremism. Our military forces can't fix the refugee problem coming out of Syria and Iraq, and neither can Russian military intervention. Nor can the United States set up democracies out of a box or install some kind of a software program that brings good governance. Across the Arab world, the people living there are going to have to resolve their problems and build their own communities. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore the Middle East. And I've heard some presidential candidates in this year's campaign suggesting that. We can't. We can't for our own national security interests. But what we can do is be more selective and smart and focus on helping the people on the ground who are already seeking positive change. Could we go to the next photo? So this is the story I want to end with. This is the city of Tlemcen in western Algeria. It's very close to the Moroccan border. It's a historic city. And this particular site is one of my favorites in all of the Arab world. It is the mausoleum of a holy man named Sidi Bou Midien. I was in Algeria with Ambassador Ron Newman in the 1990s. And this city, Tlemcen, was one of the worst places for fighting. There was a terrible Islamic extremist element in Tlemcen, in and around it, something called the Group Islamique Armée, the Islamic armed group, who killed people by cutting their throats, and literally thousands died in and around Tlemcen. Tlemcen was a hotbed of extremism. And really, the civil war in Algeria only began to wind down when President Bouteflika issued an amnesty about 10 years ago. When I was ambassador in Algeria in 2008, I got to go to Tlemcen, could never have gone during the horrible fighting there. So I went to Tlemcen just to see a small English language program that we had with the university there. And I took with me Amanda Johnson, was then at the time a brand new, young, first-time American diplomat whose job was to do cultural issues. And I told Amanda, we're going to a university, we're going to Tlemcen, had a lot of problems in the past, we're going to go in real quiet, we're just going to go in quietly, see the English language program, talk to the students in the English language class. How many are there, Amanda? 25? Great. We're going to talk to them, and we're going to get right out. Quiet visit. I really didn't want to be public about it because I was worried that the students would be anti-American, and it could turn ugly very quickly. The morning we visited, Israel bombed the Gaza Strip very heavily. And I said to Amanda, we're going to, real quiet, Amanda. We don't want any problems. Yes, sir, yes, sir. So we pulled up in a single car, and there was a huge line waiting. President of the university, the mayor, the head of the governorate council, deans of this, all waiting. And I looked at Amanda and I said, Amanda, what is this? She's like, I'm sorry, I told him I wanted quiet. I get out of the car, shaking hands with all these dignitaries. They pull me immediately. They say, we're going right into the biggest auditorium. And I said, no, 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 we're just going to the little English class to see the students. He said, oh, no, Mr. L'Ambassadeur, we're going into the main auditorium. We had to put it in the biggest auditorium. It's standing room only. This is a true story. It is standing room only. And I turned to Amanda. I said, Amanda, this is exactly what I didn't want. And, oh, I'm very sorry, Mr. Ambassador. I walked into this room. This is in 2008. Israel had just bombed Gaza, and the war in Iraq was raging. Lots of Iraqis getting killed. I thought I would be murdered. I went into this hall and I got a standing ovation. And I'm sure they were disappointed that I didn't look like Harrison Ford or Brad Pitt or that's the American ambassador, him. But I got a standing ovation. I was dumbfounded, literally like this. Next slide. I asked the president of the university, what is going on? Why are they cheering for an American ambassador? And he said, but you know about the effect of your programs, right? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, your English language programs and the long-distance learning programs that you have set up have done wonders here. And we had a program with the University of Missouri at Rolla in structural engineering. We taught over long-distance internet, high-speed internet that the embassy installed for them, taught structural engineering classes, a whole curriculum. And the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill had a nursing program with the University of Tlemcen, also over high-speed internet. They had to, of course, it was in English, they had to speak English first. He said, we graduated 15 students from each of those two programs last year, Mr. Ambassador, and every one of the students got a job. And you know what unemployment is like here. And of course, unemployment for young people in Algeria is well over 50%, probably near 70%. Remember the haragas I was talking about? He said the students know that. They know that they learn English and they can put on their resumes that they did these American programs. And they're all getting jobs. And so they're very happy. And he said, Mr. Ambassador, this program is a huge success. And I turned to Amanda and I said, way to go, Amanda, that's excellent. That program cost $1 million total, sunk costs. $1 million. At that time, we were spending over $500 million a day in Iraq. I leave you then with this thought. We can't fix the sectarianism, the violence, the refugees, the unmet demands for human rights. We can't fix those. I think we can be sensitive to the problems, and I think acknowledging that the United Nations Charter of Universal Human Rights is supposed to be actually applied universally would be a good start. And there may be some instances where some discrete efforts, like long-distance learning in Tlemcen, but not micromanagement, can give help to people on the ground and give them tools to make their own lives better and their own communities more prosperous. And those kinds of American efforts may take time, they will take time, but we should give the people in the region that time. We don't need to push them, we need to encourage them and let the people of the region go forward from there. That kind of thinking, encouraging, not pushing, that's the approach of the Middle East Institute's team. And it's an approach that I'm really proud to be a part of. Thank you very much for listening to me, and enjoy your dinner.